Hello and welcome to another spoiler discussion of Umineko. This episode will contain spoilers for the whole dang game. Do not watch this unless you've already played it, because you won't know what I'm talking about. There's also going to be some discussion in this episode of corpses, murder, and also those corpses being moved, manipulated, and mutilated. The chapters on this video will have the content warnings flagged in them if you want to avoid those sections. And then finally, last format note, we are finally at the murders. And I think what I'm going to do for any time I'm going to speculate about the how of the murder, I'm going to put all of that at the end of the episode. Again, the chapter markers will make that clear. But I'm going to spend the start of the episode going through the different themes and thematic elements and aspects and things that I think about going through these sections. And then in the back half do the kind of theory crafting of like, oh, how did this work? How could you have made it seem as though there were 6 bodies? Or were there 6 bodies? Or how does this pan out kind of stuff? I'll put all those in the back mostly so that I don't need to try and mix the two conversations because they're quite different ends. So before we get to the actual murders, there's some stuff in part 10 I want to hit on first. The conversation between Shannon and Kanon in the guest house servant room, where Shannon talks about being invited to play with the kids, and Kanon is saying, well, we can't, it's not our job, our job is to be furniture, so you are explicitly just cannot go and do that. But does ultimately let her go, and is just kind of being a hard ass but not actually following through on it. It is interesting to think about the ways in which these two people have roles that are specifically kind of almost crafted for them. Because in particular, I was thinking about Kanon in this section that, based on the timeline suggested thus far, Kanon's kind of the more cynical one, that I believe comes from losing faith in the idea that Battler would honor his promise and starting to realize that Battler has made no contact with Shannon for years. That Shannon at that point was starting to think maybe he's actually just forgotten, doesn't care, never intended the promise, or any number of these things. And at that point, Kanon could exist as a person and he would work as an observer to try and watch people, understand them, kind of take in more how they behave and how they act, and read them more, because that tends to be what Kanon does, but that also Kanon's a little bit more cynical about his position as a servant and as furniture, and is more resigned to his fate and basically does not expect better things. He has accepted his lot in life and doesn't expect it to change. And we know that Kanon is going to change over the course of the game, so that's going to be interesting to track. And I'll probably have more thoughts about Shannon's role, or what that might be, or what might underpin her role, as we go through episode 2 in particular, because I know that's going to dig more into her and George. But speaking of her and George, we also get their first proper romantic scene. They've obviously interacted before, but this is where they get to be a little bit more on. George gets to be a clown who compares historical battle tactics to modern capitalism. It's very funny. It is extremely fitting for him, especially as a person who needs a way to valorize his father, who runs a business. And my first time playing, I had an incredibly poor view of George. I did not like the idea that this man was romancing a servant and literally giving her orders to force her to engage with him in certain ways, because he literally has to order her to not use the technically correct honorifics. He instead wants her to use more familiar ones. In my first time playing, I thought this was pretty scummy, the ways in which he is giving her orders to force her behavior and insist upon how she engages socially in certain ways. And kind of given how the ending of the game asks of you to give more charitable reads to characters and to meet them where they are and think about things on their terms, I can see the less shitty read of this where he is using the fact that he has the power in this dynamic to try and motivate her to make choices that we do know she wants. We do know she likes George. We know that this is not him compelling her into a relationship she is not interested in. Given that knowledge, it is not that shitty a thing to say, I know that implicit orders require that you do not interact with me in these ways, so I'm going to give you explicit orders to counteract those, to do the thing that I know you want. Or in George's case, I guess doesn't technically know, but he knows her pretty well, so he can make that assertion fairly confidently. And the main reason I am willing to have this charitable read is because of the way in which he understands he cannot force her decision at the end. He makes it explicitly a request and not an order that she take the ring and wear it or not if she wants, wear it wherever she wants, whichever hand, whichever finger, and that he will just leave that to her. And the thing I find very interesting is that he's even managed to make it a request that she can fulfill very easily. She does not need to give him an answer verbally, she does not need to try and engage him in conversation. She can signal, and he will not follow up. If she has signaled no, he will accept this and move on. I do believe that, he is that kind of person. So again, this is him kind of meeting her where she is. He can give her orders to push her to make certain choices that she would prefer but might not make otherwise. And at the same time, he will stop giving orders at the point which he knows it has to be by her own volition, but he's set up a situation where she doesn't need to overstep to be able to answer him. And this is interesting when it comes to later when he gets her answer, because even in death, she is able to answer him. And I have more thoughts on that, but those have more to do with Beatrice than Shannon. Because, ultimately, George gets a yes. George, when he finds Shannon, finds that she is wearing the ring on a finger that indicates she would have married him had she not died. However, the question of Shannon's death is a tricky one. Beatrice killed Shannon is not that complex. Where they got the sixth body, or what the sixth bodies actually are, different question we'll get to. But because Beatrice killed Shannon, what version of events happened? Did Shannon say yes, or did Beatrice say yes? Did Beatrice put the ring on Shannon's finger after death to give George a yes that would still be a yes she wouldn't have to follow through on? Is it in some ways a kind of comfort to George, knowing that they wouldn't actually be able to be married and wouldn't be able to carry this marriage through? Because Shannon's death in this situation is effectively Shannon as a person no longer existing, and instead, Beatrice or Kanon are ultimately going to be the person in this body. So, in some sense, they are rejecting the path forward of being Shannon and being married to George, while still wearing the ring and accepting his love, even if they're not accepting that future. And I am going to jump forward here because actually this parallels very directly with how Hideyoshi talks about Shannon when George asks about the ring. Because when George asks, and he's clearly distressed about Shannon, I feel like there's at least a soft implication that Eva and Hideyoshi knew to some extent about George's relationship or interest in Shannon, but that more specifically him being distraught and asking about the ring and seeing the ring, thinking who else could have possibly given her that ring, they figure it out in that moment. And instead of the very likely concern that this would bring out, and Ava is about to object and say, George, what are you thinking? You couldn't possibly do this. Hideyoshi stops her, because he knows that if Shannon is dead, that this is obviously not a problem they need to deal with. In some sense, this is now only a theoretical issue. And so instead, Hideyoshi takes this time to comfort George, insist upon how happy they would have been, in some ways almost imply the ways that him and Ava would be accepting and supportive of this relationship, without having to reveal what the actual truth of the situation could have been if George and Shannon lived and revealed this to both of them. And I don't mean that this is a manipulative thing that Hideyoshi is doing in particular. This is a comfort he's trying to offer. But it's a kind of comfort that doesn't have to be confronted with the light of reality. Like, they don't have to actually live through the situation to interrogate whether or not they really would be that chill about it. But let's go back. I'll briefly come back to Jessica giving the charm to Natsuhi, and how that seems to have saved Natsuhi. The charm itself is kind of a symbolic representation of something, that it has magical power in that with magical thinking you can extrapolate that this charm must have saved Natsuhi. When thinking about the characters involved, I feel like there's a good reason Natsuhi survives this whole episode is because Beatrice takes pity on Natsuhi, also cares about Jessica, and seeing that the moment of connection that happened between those two that is represented by this charm means that Beatrice doesn't want to take away Natsuhi, at least not first. Which is an interesting thing as well, given the characters involved, because Beatrice has good reason to have complete disdain for the family in general, but Natsuhi in particular is a terror to the servants, especially the one-winged eagle servants. And yet, sparing Natsuhi could be seen as extending some empathy to her and the situation she is in, because as we've seen, Natsuhi can be pretty shitty about things, but is also under the heel of other people in other ways. And speaking of Natsuhi and being under people's heels, I love the scene flowing from Ava and Natsuhi kind of arguing, going to Kinzo's room, where Natsuhi projects a Kinzo that is proud of her, that outright says he would love for her to have been a man so she could have been a proper successor, and that's certainly the only reason she never got that kind of recognition. It's very good because of the ways in which Natsuhi has to project a figure to give her a pep talk that the other actual men in her life would never give her, but that she desperately needs. I especially love that by getting this confidence boost that she has given to herself, she can go around and head out and basically dismantle Ava in a moment just by being very confident, not being affected by the things Ava says, but delivering a precision strike to Ava's insecurity, because Ava constantly jabs at other people because she is an insecure person who does not feel confident or comfortable and needs to destabilize everyone else around her to feel okay. And as soon as someone's not destabilized and is in fact just slapping back, she has trouble dealing with that, especially when it has to do with her father. So I did mention this earlier, and I think this is going to be somewhat of an ongoing question. But what does it mean that Shannon's died? They don't seem to know she is missing at first, because they talk about the guests and they talk about Goda, since he's obviously not in cooking breakfast, but they don't seem to flag the idea that Shannon is gone, and that's understandable because Kanon is going around doing work and they can't physically both be present and doing things at the same time. However, before they find the bodies, they do notice that Shannon is gone. So my question there is there some sort of physical evidence that Shannon was gone? Perhaps are her clothes missing such that Kanon can't swap over to Shannon? Or is there some other indication? Is it perhaps almost a mental block that Beatrice, having murdered Shannon, Kanon can no longer talk to her or embody her as a person? clothing and outfits feel like a somewhat safe bet because those are a marker of identity, those are a way you can embody a person in particular, and we do know later that the corpses are dressed in clothing to indicate who they are. So that feels more appropriate for what's going on in this moment, but I'm not clear on the metaphysics of the situation, and I'm going to be curious as we go on how Shannon and Kanon dying is represented, and if it is consistent or if it might vary by author. We haven't talked too much about what it means to have different authors on these episodes, but it will come up as we switch in future ones. We'll later get into the whodunit style aspects of this, but one thing that is interesting is the way that in the discovering of the bodies, they are identified by their clothes. Battler in particular will say that he could tell them by their clothes and will refer to the costumes they are wearing and how those are indicative of their identities, which is very thematically resonant given what we know about Shannon and Kanon and how they have the same body but they use different outfits to present as different people, and somehow there is a separate person presenting as Shannon while Kanon is standing there presenting as himself. And this muddies the waters about the assumption that a singular body can only present as their true singular person. And there's an interesting additional aspect to how Beatrice has done this, because Battler refers to them all being given makeup, which he means the kind of blood on them, the ways in which their faces have been mangled and distorted horrifically. But these are also alterations to how they present themselves. These are pretty gruesome versions of how someone will make up their face to show themselves and to be the face that they present to people. And I read this a little bit as Beatrice is taking away their ability to present as themselves and mocking the family's overall narrow-minded assumption about identity, costume, and body all being intrinsically linked by magicking up a sixth person. How she did that we'll be getting into very soon, but one final thing I do want to mention here that I think is interesting is that Beatrice has kind of forced these costumes and this makeup onto these bodies, and I think that pairs well with Hideyoshi insisting to George that he shouldn't look at Shannon in this state because he should remember Shannon when she was able to make the choice about how she presented herself to him. She would rather George remembers the face and the person she showed to him than the person that Beatrice has made for George to see, for George and the rest to see. And I think it would make sense for, say, Beatrice to want to get revenge on this family and to mock their foolish ideas about identity, because in a sense Beatrice is teasing them all for not being able to see who she is and lacking the imagination to recognize her as an independent person. And one of the ways she can mock them is by both killing them and then dressing them up and rearranging how they present in a way that allows her to disguise the fact that she has killed one of her own persons and in a sense has helped to disguise her nature as a culprit. So, on that note, let's get to theory time. So, now, this is mostly for fun, because I know the culprit is Beatrice, and Beatrice is a person who shares the same body as Shannon and Kanon. But I still want to dig into the mechanics of this a little bit, especially because I think it's interesting that, broadly speaking, the first episode and the second episode have a lot of similarities, in a sense that it feels like a first and second draft of the mystery novel that Beatrice's writing, effectively, when she's thinking about what'll happen in this fateful weekend. A lot of things get refined in the second episode to make them a little bit more complicated and tricky and like tightly written. A really obvious example that I even noticed on the first time through was in this episode, the servants have kind of master keys, and there's a lot of keys floating around in general, and it's actually just very loose, and it's very easy for people to get access to keys at different points. In the next one, the servants having keys is extremely locked down. Natsuhi has ensured that there are not spare keys floating around the place, and that each servant has exactly one, and all sorts of other stipulations that really limit access to keys and make, in theory, the mystery a lot more tightly written and a lot harder to kind of work around. We'll get to that then, but that means that this first mystery is a little bit more open, but I'm still interested in kind of poking at the specifics of what I think happened, especially knowing the identity of the culprit. So some interesting initial facts to kind of think about and put on the table. There was shift changing back and forth, but ultimately, the way the servants shook out. Kanon Kumasawa and Genji were all in the guest house, entirely separate from where this first set of murders happened, while Shannon and Goda were both in the mansion itself. Given the fact that Shannon interacted with Goda, it does seem that Shannon was the one in control of the body, so the body itself was in the mansion, which makes sense because the body then went and did the murders, and then presumably the next morning went back to the guest house so that Kanon could take over and go and open up the mansion. In terms of constructing a rudimentary timeline, this means that basically Beatrice had a pretty free reign of she had locked herself into the mansion with all the people. She killed the majority of the people in that mansion, leaving Eva, Hideyoshi and Natsuhi because she only needed 6 sacrifices this far. Then obviously she could take them to the end of the way shed. The big question mark is, where did the extra body come from? Because Beatrice obviously had to kill these people and leave them, and then her leave and go to the guest house so that Kanon could use the body and continue on in the morning. But of course, there appear to be 6 bodies in the shed. An unlikely answer to this is that Shannon's body is not truly a body, but is something approximating one to just in poor lighting conditions seem to be her. It does mention that she is in the shadow of a mountain of objects and part of her face is missing, and obviously the various ways they've talked about the corpses being messed with. But an alternative that at least currently makes more sense to me is that they did in fact have a spare body they could use. Kinzo has died. His body is being kept somewhere. Is it being partially preserved? One would think they'd attempt to do that so that when he is officially and legally dead, there aren't questions being raised about why his body is so old. Though, then again, in later episodes we do know Kinzo's body will be found in the furnace, which I assume is to disguise the state of his body at the time. Or possibly to also switch that body. We'll see. In terms of setting up a theory of how this was all done, I think early on I'm going to be posing some questions because I expect the rest of the episode to prove or disprove some of these directions. But in the given moment, I am most convinced that Kinzo's body has been brought in alongside the other 5, and that's the trick. That's the way in which 5 bodies being killed can be made to represent 6 people who have been killed. Some evidence effectively pointing towards this is that they don't spend a lot of time looking at these. They don't get to do very detailed examinations, and Nanjo, the doctor they're using to examine these people, straight up says, "I'm a GP. I should not be examining corpses. That's not my area of expertise, and I cannot make conclusions, and no one should listen when I do make them. And even aside from that, identifying bodies is not simple. If you're looking at people in a dark shed and it's windy and rainy outside, and their faces are covered in blood, and their teeth have been removed, and their cheeks have been distressed, a lot of what would be a normally identifiable face has been mangled. And at that point, you will rely on things you can fall back on, such as their clothing. The thing that is supposed to outwardly display their identity, which they're all wearing their normal outfits. They're wearing the clothes they would have been wearing during the day yesterday, including Shannon. And that is indeed flagged as a way in which they identify themselves. Not to mention the ring being a clear, specific symbol that Beatrice would know about to indicate that that is Shannon. I believe Kinzo is still going to be killed later in this episode, if I remember correctly. So at that point, whether or not we see a body is an important question, and even if we do, is it a body that could have been taken from the shed? They put a new padlock on the shed in this moment, but I don't know if they ever come back to confirm the padlock was not removed. One thing that in later chapters will be much more closely monitored is a lock does not mean anything in and of itself. A lock is only meaningful if you prove that it has not been unlocked. So if no one ever checks that the padlock was not removed, it is pretty trivial to snip it, open the door, take a body, put it in the furnace to hide the fact that you've had to move it around the place. The shed is flagged as being out of the way because it's an ugly shed that they wouldn't want to have to look at. So it would not be easy to spot that it had been snipped unless someone went out of their way to check. And in general, I think the family gets pretty preoccupied with other matters later. But that's another thing I'll be keeping an eye on as it comes up or doesn't. And that's going to do it for this spoiler episode. It's fun to be starting to get into the murders as we will start to untangle this thread and see where we get snagged and try to parse through what's going on and what seems to make sense or doesn't. But until next time, thank you for watching.